And so now I would like to bring out the chair of the Marie Northrop Lecture Series Committee, Michael Holland, who is also the city archivist for the City of Los Angeles and works with me at the Records Management Division of the City Clerk's Office. I'm going to bring out Michael Holland to introduce the speaker.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming out this afternoon, and everyone's on time. How wonderful is that? All right. The second speaker in our series for this year, the series titled We Are Change. We're taking advantage of Women's History Month to bring Janice Hahn out to speak today about her family, because as incredible as it may seem, if you go looking for information or a family history or pretty much anything about the Hahns, you don't find that much outside of a couple of LA Times pieces and a Wikipedia entry on Kenneth and one on Gordon and one on Janice and Jim. So other than that, there is not a lot of good information out there right now, and certainly nothing firsthand. And so I'm hoping we can add a little bit more to that pool of information today with Supervisor Hahn. And so I'm very, very grateful that she's actually given us a couple of hours of her time today, and I hope that if we have time for Q&A, I hope some of you will have a good question for her, possibly about the family or something else, an issue that we raised perhaps. We're going to start with a couple of very short video clips, and then we'll head to our discussion. We will have a PowerPoint presentation that will be up on the screen as well. Most of the photos and images of that slideshow are actually from the Huntington, because they have the Kenneth Hahn collection, his papers. There are a few items that have come from the city archive, however, and if anyone asks me about those, I'll point those out. I don't see a need to. But we have, I think, some very, very good material, and hopefully we'll get some good stories and some good information from the supervisor today. And so without further ado, we're going to go ahead and start the film, and then we'll move to the two chairs.
Ladies and gentlemen, these juveniles of your community are entering what many eminent jurists term the Los Angeles County Crime School. As they are being held for trial, they are confined with hardened criminals, murderers, robbers, sex maniacs, and others who teach them the tricks of their trade, and eventually cost this community millions of dollars to rectify. Some of these boys are as young as 14 years of age, and none of them are over 18. They're compelled to eat and sleep on the floor without the benefit of bunks or even mattresses. As many as 4 and 5 are locked in one cell with only these inadequate toilet facilities available for their common needs. Maximum security levers lock these young boys behind steel bars holding crime-hardened men. While awaiting trial, this is how they are compelled to visit their loved ones, discussing their future behind darkened screens revealing only the images of their visitors. Speaking officially for this inexcusable juvenile delinquency situation is Supervisor Kenneth Hahn.
My colleagues and I on the Board of Supervisors, along with the members of the County Grand Jury and the Public Welfare Commission, and all others interested in honest, good government, are deeply concerned about the facilities of our juveniles in the county jail. As you have seen for yourself, the conditions are intolerable. It's a crime against society itself to allow this situation to exist any longer. You have a way to help. Vote yes on Proposition A on June 8th.
Vote yes on Proposition A. Ms. Hahn.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Ms. Lane Victory.
Yes. Colleagues, to this day, I remain shocked that our World War II merchant mariners are still fighting for their much-deserved GI rights. During the war, President Franklin Roosevelt had promised merchant mariners that they would be entitled to these rights. Unfortunately, he died before that could happen. World War II merchant mariners suffered the highest casualty rate of any of the branches of service while they delivered troops, tanks, food, airplanes, fuel, and other needed supplies. Compared to the large number of men and women serving in World War II, the number of merchant mariners was small, but their contribution was invaluable. Yet despite their dedication to this country, merchant mariners were denied their rights under the GI Bill of Rights, which Congress enacted in 1945. The service of our merchant mariners cannot be forgotten. They deserve full GI benefits, especially now that the average age of our veterans is 85. I've been urging Congress since I've gotten elected in 2001 to pass the belated thank you to the Merchant Mariners of World War II Act. This bill provides each eligible veteran a monthly benefit of $1,000, which would go to their surviving spouse or children. I've sent letters, we've passed resolutions before, and yet it is still not done. Every year in San Pedro on May 22nd, which is Merchant Mariners Day, we talk about this. There are a few surviving merchant mariners that come to that event. We have the USS Lane Victory, which was a merchant mariner ship that's docked down in San Pedro. This just makes sense. My Uncle Gordon actually was in the Merchant Marines. You've supported this in the past. I just think we ought to do it one more time and go on record to urge Congress to pass H.R. 23, the belated thank you to the Merchant Mariners of World War II Act of 2009. Let's do this one more time. It's time to act. Let's ask Congress to do this.
Thank you, Ms. Hahn.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce Supervisor Janice Hahn.
Hello, everybody, and good afternoon. I agree with that woman that was speaking. I associate myself with her remarks.
Well, again, thank you for coming out. I think we've got our visuals good. Okay, so we in front of the Hahn home, and Hattie was your grandmother, and her 7 sons. And the first question I have is, who were the Hahns? Where did they come from? What brought them to LA? And what happened once they got to Los Angeles?
Well, thanks, Michael, and again, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this series and representing women everywhere for Women's History Month. I appreciate all of you who've come out on a sort of a rainy Sunday afternoon. I love this picture of Hattie Hahn and her 7 boys, and you can really see in this photo a very strong woman, a woman of great resolve, and when you learn this story about Hattie and her boys, you will be even more impressed. You know, people wonder how the Hahns got into public service. You know, why is it in our DNA? It started with the boys' father, John Hahn, who was actually a mayor of a city in Canada, of Kindersley, in Saskatchewan. And he was a mayor. And John, his name was John Hahn, was married to Hattie. At the time, they had 6 boys, and Hattie was with child, her 7th. John had a heart condition. And in those days, this would have been in the 1920, early 20, they would send people to Los Angeles for the weather, for the climate. A lot of people that had health conditions were told to go to Los Angeles for healing qualities of our climate. So John first came from Canada down to Los Angeles to look for a house before he sent for Hattie and the 6 boys. He found a house. It was 59th and Flower, where they all grew up. And so he sent for Hattie. Hattie left her the only life that she knew. She was a mayor's wife in Kindersley, Canada. I understand they might have even had a little bit of money at that time. And before their furniture arrived in Los Angeles, John succumbed to a heart attack and died. There was Hattie. She was a foreigner, right? She had 6 boys, pregnant with what she would find out would be her 7th boy, who ended up being my father. And then, to make matters worse, there was an uncle that actually told Hattie that he would invest her money for her and so that everything would be okay. Took every penny she had and squandered it. So she was penniless, she was a widow, she was a foreigner, and she was a single mother of 7 boys under the age of 10. You know, when people ask me kind of, you know, where I get, you know, my resolve and my strength, obviously it's clear it came from my dad, but it really, I think it was Hattie. Hattie was a woman that figured out how to take care of her boys. They did not have it easy. My father grew up in abject poverty. They kind of didn't really know where their next meal was coming from, but she put all the boys to work. I think my dad's first job was when he was 5 years old selling magazines. She was a strong woman. She told her boys, always remember you're a Hahn. And I don't think they even knew what that meant. But it was, you know, her mantra, remember you're a Hahn. You know, you be proud of yourself, you know, sit up and act right, and we're going to make something of ourselves. And all 7 of her boys, actually, they did different professional jobs, but they all were very successful in their own right.
When you look at the lineup there, starting from the left, the one on the left, that was Henry. He was the oldest.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the one that had the garage, correct?
The gas station at Gage and Main.
And all the brothers took their turns working at the garage on Saturdays or other times, whether or not they knew what they were doing or not. As you told me, your Uncle George,
right,
who eventually became a minister,
right,
which was good because he definitely didn't have mechanics skills.
He did not. His older brother Henry just said, you know, some car came in and needed a quart of oil, and went, George, go give him a quart of oil. George didn't know a thing about cars, didn't know where to put a quart of oil. So he got a quart of oil and lifted the hood and just poured it all over the engine, thinking that he was going to give this guy his money's worth. He was going to do the whole quart of oil. So yeah, and maybe, who knows, maybe he did that so he didn't have to work there anymore on Saturdays.
So, but your father's first job was selling magazines at age 5, and so do you think that was where he picked up his salesmanship?
Clearly he was a salesman. I think he won some awards in the state of California selling the most magazines in his category. And I think that's where he learned to sell. And you could tell even from that initial clip when he was asking voters to vote for Proposition A for jail conditions, which seems to me might have been a hard sale. Not everybody believes in improving the quality of life for those who are behind bars. But you could tell from that clip he was selling it. And he always saw himself as a seller of ideas. And when you look at the things that Kenny Hahn did, whether it was the call boxes or the paramedics or building a hospital in Watts, he was a salesman. My dad never took a public opinion poll in his life. he didn't really care what people were already thinking. He believed it was his job to lead them, to teach them, to educate them, and sort of bring them to where he was in terms of good government and good things for the County of Los Angeles. So yeah, quite a salesman.
I mean, obviously you never knew her, but
Yeah,
what did your father, what did your uncles and their families say about her?
Yeah, she unfortunately passed away before I was born, but they all, the boys just revered their mom, just loved her, respected her. She was a very strong woman. She drugged them all to church every Sunday. They actually attended Angelus Temple and actually would hear Amy Semple McPherson give her incredible sermons where she would invoke, I think she invoked the city fire department on her sermons of, get on fire for Christ. I think she would open the back doors and in would roll the sirens of the firefighters. So she was a very, very, very strong woman. Religious, strong, probably didn't mess around, no nonsense, and expected the boys to, really show respect and to be respected.
But she always did, but she wasn't always that strong, as you told me at one point, if you want to talk
Well,
about that.
the very touching story is, I sort of skipped over from being destitute, a foreigner, a widow, penniless, 7 boys under the age of 10, to she figured it out. But there was a moment, we were all told, where Hattie felt she was not going to make it. She was in this new country. She felt very desperate and alone, and even thought briefly of taking her 7 little boys into the kitchen and turning on the gas oven because she did not know where the next meal was going to come from, who was going to take care of her, how she was going to survive. And I think this is why she drugged the boys to Angelus Temple, because she thought better of what she was going to do and felt very deeply the presence of God, and that everything was going to be okay, and that her boys would be okay. And she turned on the kitchen radio, and I guess it was Amy Semple McPherson preaching a sermon, and she took that sort of as a sign that they would be okay. She didn't know how she would be okay. There was no evidence that changed in her circumstance that she would be okay, but there was something about her. So she was a deep woman, a woman of deep faith, that her boys would be okay. And I learned a lot from that.
Good. So your father goes into the Navy for World War II. Gordon goes into the Merchant Marines. The war ends, and I hopefully we'll get to talk about the Merchant Marine thing a little bit later on. So your father decides to run for city council. And it sounded like it became a bit of a family enterprise considering where the headquarters was.
Mm-hmm. Well, before that, when he came home from the war, he taught at Pepperdine College when Pepperdine was at 79th in Vermont. And he taught government, American history. And it was in that's where he met my mom. He met my mom at Pepperdine. It was in that one of his classes that he was teaching about government and how to get involved, be civic-minded to his students. His student said, "Gee, Mr. Hahn, you talk a good game about how to be involved and how to make a difference. Why don't you run for office?" And so his students challenged him. And so he said, "Okay, I'll run for office. Tell you what," again, you could not do this today in any respectable college class. He said, I'll make a deal with you. You can either write a 5,000-word theme on how to get elected to the city council in Los Angeles, or work on my campaign. Then he went even farther, which again, you could not do today. He said, and we'll keep track of the precincts that you decide to work in. If I win your precinct, you'll get an A in the class. Again, can you know, he would have been, you know, disciplined, censured, probably removed from his teaching position. So all of his students got involved in his very first campaign for city council, and again, walked precincts. The gas station at Gage and Main became kind of the unofficial headquarters, and when people would come in for gas, they would leave, unbeknownst to them, with a Hahn for city council bumper sticker on their rear bumper. So they sent cars out all over Los Angeles with Hahn for city council. And as you found out, he had a recount in that race. He didn't win it outright. And one of his brothers, I think it was Louis, who ended up being the accountant, was mathematical. And he was the one that said, Kenny, we can do that. Ask for a recount, because the odds are we will pick up enough votes and you're going to win this. And sure enough.
And that's exactly. So, you know, you hear about recounts not being terribly effective. This time it was.
And he was 26 years old, so at that time he was the youngest person to ever be elected to the city council. Now, Roz Wyman was 22, so she beat him on that one. She was the first woman and the youngest to ever be elected to the city council. But yeah, he was 26. He wasn't married. My mom and dad were not married. He still lived at home when he won his first city council race. But that was 1946.
A page from the court document about the recount. Oh, there we go. And so there he is being sworn. So there he is being sworn into his first council term.
Mm-hmm. There's Hattie.
With his mother there, mm-hmm. And the minute clerk A.M. Morris. And that's the actual page.
I know, I love that.
That he signed. This, of course, is in the archive, and so I found that, and so there it is.
I love that because, you know, obviously I have a lot of full circle moments, right? Things that he did and things I did. I see my former colleague Tom LaBonge in the audience, and we both did the exact same thing. We got sworn in and we signed the oath of office. Just like that with our city clerk. So it's kind of fun to think that I did that many years later.
Yep. Everyone works for the city signs the book in one form or another. Now this one let me ask you something. Was your father the kind of person who would save everything? I mean, I don't mean like being a hoarder, but did he hold on to things, or did he hold on to those things that were important?
He did, but there were things over the years that he talked about he wished he had held on to.
Okay.
Like when he was dispatched to find a baseball team. He and Roz Wyman were dispatched to find a baseball team, and they were at the World Series where the Washington Senators were playing, and Walter O'Malley, and they weren't even looking at the Dodgers, but Walter O'Malley sent a napkin with an usher at that game, and it said, "Don't talk to anyone until you talk to me, Walter O'Malley." That he wished he had saved.
Well, the reason I
And
asked,
the rest is history on who ended up coming to Los Angeles.
no, the reason I asked that is that this newspaper clipping is also in the Huntington papers.
Uh-huh.
And I'm thinking, okay, it's a clipping. Why would something like that have been saved?
Yeah.
Until I guess you realized what was going on in this and what became of that after.
Well, he did have big books that his mother for a few years there, she physically would put them in the scrapbook when his name would appear in the newspaper. So he had these big books, and my staff is smiling because I'm a big lover of the real paper, the clips. When I was on the city council, I used the same clipping service that my dad did, Allen's clipping service, and it was a big thrill to every month get a big old envelope with all the places that your name had shown up. And I remember my dad sitting in our living room going through clippings. He also loved to see where his name showed up. My brother and I were given a job on Saturdays. We would look through either the Wave or the Sentinel. We got to choose, and we got $1 every time we found Kenny Hahn's name. So that was a big deal, was these clippings.
Yeah. And so, of course, this was one of the initiatives that I guess he took upon himself to do something like this, where at a dangerous intersection, because he saw the need for it.
Yeah, apparently he was known as Stop and Go Kenny. That was one of his nicknames. He was a big believer in putting stop signs at dangerous intersections. And I will tell you, being with my dad, my whole life, and having people come up to him, whether we were in church or, restaurant or something, and many of those people that would come up and shake his hand would say, "You put a stop sign at this particular corner." Sometimes it was around a church, right? Because the parishioners would park across the street and the church would be across the street. It was walking back and forth. It was very dangerous. And my father absolutely will give you a stop sign. He really believed that stop signs saved people's lives. I ended up carrying on that tradition as well. And this was a signal, right when I first got elected to the Board of Supervisors. This little boy, Cruz, was hit crossing that street, walking home from school, and broke both his legs, I think. And so the community had been asking for a signal for a while, and they kept saying it's an accident waiting to happen. And so as soon as I got elected, I immediately told my county Department of Public Works, get this signal in as fast as possible. And so that was a really special day when we turned the signal on, and we walked across the street safely.
Yeah, things are a lot different now as far as being able to get things done than, say, back in your father's day. Just to touch briefly on things like term limits. I mean, you don't have as much time to be able to do the things that are important to you that you want to do, whereas back in Bob Farrell's day or your father's day, I mean, you could assume that you would eventually lose a re-election bid, but as long as you wanted to run and keep on, and the people kept on supporting you, you'd be able to work as long as you wanted to. So knowing that there is a clock running from the minute that you get into office nowadays, does that change the way you look at what you want to prioritize, what things are really important to you?
I do. I mean, I think term limits, voters, for some reason, really believed that term limits was their only tool that they had to remove politicians who just weren't budging. But I think in the long run, I'm not sure it has produced better government or better people running for office. And I think the enormity of the problems that you undertake, and when I look at my dad's legacy, big things that he was known for, whether it was putting the call boxes on the freeway or starting the paramedic program, building the hospital in Watts, bringing the Dodgers to Los Angeles, those were done, the Dodgers was probably the quickest thing he did, and he did that in about 8 years. But all his big initiatives were more like year 25, year 30, year 35 of a 40-year career. And it sort of takes a while to understand the governments you're working with, the city government, the county government, the state government, the federal government. There's a lot of intergovernmental work you have to do to accomplish things for your particular municipality. So for me, I do know that the most I could serve is 12 years as a county supervisor. But I always try to tell my staff, we've got 4 years, right? That's really all I have is 4 years. Then I'm going to run for re-election, and maybe I'll have another 4 years. But we can't really even think about 12 years. We have to think about 4 years and what we can do now. And I do believe for me there's more of a sense of urgency. And I find I'm less patient with bureaucracy, and I'm less patient with department heads who say, oh, we can't do that, or it's never been done like that, or I'm not sure that can happen. I have less patience. I have a sense of urgency.
And I hope we can talk a little bit about that, the priorities and things that you have, and just to kind of clue everyone in why she does not like the word legacy. And I hope we can talk about it, because I found that particularly fascinating. Now, this is the basically the badge that would be on the windshield in the car when Kenny was driving a city car on city business, and sometimes that would include you on weekends.
Many times.
There's the stories about him finding potholes in the district and calling them in and doing all of that.
He was a big believer in touring his district, right? He loved driving every street in his district. And of course, the second district probably is the most compact of the supervisorial district. My district, currently the 4th district, is huge. It's an hour just from San Pedro to Whittier, Diamond Bar, Hacienda Heights, and that's just one direction. And then my district goes all the way the other way to Marina del Rey. So I probably don't drive every street in my district like my dad did, but he was known for taking a different route to work every day, just so he could see things, look for potholes, look for places where stop signs could go, look for trees that need to be trimmed. He was kind of his own field deputy. He loved driving his own district, and when he would find something, he would, as soon as he got to work, he'd say, I want this fixed, I want this trimmed, I want this pothole filled, and if it wasn't, then someone would be held accountable. But that's what he loved to do. He didn't depend on other people telling him what was going on in his district. He did love to drive it. And he would throw Jim and I in the back seat on Saturdays, and I guess that was my mom's day to be at home by herself. And he would take us, and we would look at storm drain projects, and we would look at street resurfacing, and we would look at all sorts of projects in the district. That's what he did for fun.
Now, as a kid, did you find that enjoyable, or is it just another one of those, oh, do we have to look at another storm drain thing or another sewer pipe thing?
Yes, I probably wasn't as thrilled. I was kind of waiting for the reward at the end of the day, which was, ice cream or something. But I probably wasn't a big fan of looking at storm drains. How did I know then that all that stuff would probably be in the recesses of my brain, and it would all come back?
Good. Now these are some campaign materials from his first Supervisor campaign. And so obviously we're using the photo of Hattie and the boys, and also the photograph of your father leaving the house in the morning with your mother there. What was your mother like?
Ramona was a saint.
We don't hear about
her. You don't hear about Ramona enough. But she was a saint, and she was again, met my dad when she was a student at Pepperdine. And in those days, she got married, and she actually left college. She had like 11 units left shy of her degree, but that wasn't important to her. She had found the man she would marry. She wanted to have 2 children. She wanted to have a boy and then a girl. That's exactly what she did. And she kept our home together. And she allowed all of us to sort of be who we wanted to be. She kept the home fires burning. She had dinner every night at 6 o'clock. We would all sit down at the kitchen table. And even when my father would go back out for evenings, because the job of elected officials, you usually go out every evening somewhere and do something. But she insisted that he come home and eat. And we all ate together as a family. And so I, growing up, never really thought my dad wasn't home all the time. I didn't really notice that he left again to go out to another event. But that was important to her. She was the daughter of missionaries. My mother was born in Tokyo, Japan, as the daughter of Christian missionaries, and lived there till she was 11 years old. So she had a very interesting. She also had 6 siblings, and grew up. They would come back to the United States maybe once a year to get reconnected with their churches or the United States. And she said it was the most humiliating thing for her, because they would take all 7 little kids and put them up on like the church stage on a Sunday night and try to have people take them home, right? So they would sing, Jesus Loves Me in Japanese, and they would be farmed out to complete strangers. So I think that impacted her. She was very shy. She did not like the spotlight. And it was sort of like be seen, but don't be heard. And that was Ramona. She never wanted to give a speech. She would have never been comfortable, subbing for my father or doing anything if he couldn't make something. She was not a member of a garden society. She didn't lunch with the ladies. My mother was all about keeping the home going for her dear sweet husband and her 2 kids. My dad will have credited her with his ability to be so successful and so much there for the people of his district, because he knew that Ramona was taking care of him. Now, that was not a role model that I followed, but she, in her time,
that's what she wanted to do. And Pepperdine later gave her her honorary degree when we petitioned them, said she was 11 units short. Come on, give her her degree.
Okay. Yeah, this is again from some of the campaign material. This is a photo of him being sworn in, first time as supervisor. And so Gordon is there, the president of Pepperdine is there, your parents are there, of course. Hattie's not there because she had passed away by that point in time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because when he was elected to the County Board of Supervisors was 1952, which is the year I was born. So she had passed away. So I literally was born into county government, literally. When my mom said when she came home from the hospital with me as a teeny tiny baby, my dad was actually in the living room with his buddies planning his campaign for county supervisor. So that's all I ever knew for the first 40 years of my life was my dad as a county supervisor.
Now, of course, one of the things that I didn't know that your father actually, he had a hand in designing the county seal, what became known as the second county seal. It's actually, can we say it's the seal that you're actually wearing today?
I am. Yeah, so when my dad first became a county supervisor, the seal was a bunch of grapes. And he thought we could do better than that. So he piped up, I guess, in one of the meetings and said, can't we do better than a bunch of grapes for the county of Los Angeles? To which the other supervisors went, fine, Sonny. They called him Sonny because he was so young. Fine, Sonny, you think we could have a better seal? Why don't you design it? So he designed the next county seal. And I don't remember all the things. I left it in the back room, I think, all the icons. But the middle was the goddess Pomona. You have the oil derricks that represented Signal Hill. You have the cow, Perletta, who represented the dairy industry. You have the tuna fish, which represented the fishing industry, was very much San Pedro. One of the ships that Columbus came over on. You have the Hollywood Bowl. And then above the Hollywood Bowl, you have the cross and the two stars. And then something a lot of people don't know, but I'll tell you now. The waves, the blue waves underneath the goddess Pomona was a shout out to Pepperdine. And their mascot is the waves. So that's what the blue waves were. And then I think the 5 sort of stars on either side, I think they wanted it to be the 5 kings, which dominated the county board for a long time. Of course, now we know that's not true anymore. But many of you probably remember the ACLU filed a lawsuit against the county to remove the cross. But, you know, it did represent the influence of the missions on California and certainly on the history of LA County. But honestly, anybody that's ever sat in the Hollywood Bowl, the landscape above the Hollywood Bowl, just like that, is that cross for, yes, and then the stars. I was going to say the John Anson Ford Theater has the cross, and so really he tried to argue that that was the landscape. That's what you see when you sit in the Hollywood Bowl. But unfortunately, the supervisors it was after my dad had left that they brought the lawsuit. I think they tried to bring the lawsuit every year, and my dad just kept kicking him out of his office. But I think when he was gone, they finally, but I'm wearing today the old one, the real one, which I think the county council does not think we should wear or show. But I'm loyal to this one. But yeah, he designed that. Millard Sheets was the designer. My dad came up with the ideas and the icons, and Millard Sheets put it in the seal. It's I think it's a very unique seal. It's unfortunate that it was changed a little bit because of a lawsuit.
Okay, so here's a photo of everyone getting off the plane. Walter O'Malley is behind your father. Roz Wyman's kind of between the two of them. And that was, of course, that's something that your father was definitely part of, and that's almost become legendary. I mean, you know, it's almost superseded so many other things that he did, but it was, you know, it was and still is, you know, significant.
Right, it was pretty exciting. Like I said, they had dispatched this this envoy of elected officials from the city of Los Angeles and the county to try to get us a major league team because we didn't have one. And so again, the story was that my dad was at the game. They were kind of looking for some other teams, and Walter O'Malley approached my dad and said, "Let's talk." And Walter O'Malley, all he wanted, right, Tom, was a new stadium in New York. That's all he wanted. And the commissioner back there would not build a new stadium for the Dodgers. And so that was his, and that's so funny, that's still mostly the leverage that major league teams still have today, no matter what city they're in. They try to finagle new stadiums from the governing bodies, and that's all he wanted was a new stadium for his Dodgers, and the commissioner at the time, Morse, would not budge on that. So he said he would be interested in coming to Los Angeles, but in these talks with my dad, he said, if you speak out loud that we're having these conversations, I will deny it, because you can imagine the Brooklyn fans would have run him out of town. So he didn't speak a word, but on one trip out here, again, things that you couldn't do today, Tom, he took Walter O'Malley up in the sheriff's helicopter. Walter, where would you like to build your stadium? You know, you can see them peering over the edge of the helicopter, and they saw the Elysian Park area, and that looked like a good place for Walter O'Malley. How about that? And Kenny, who really didn't have authority at that time to actually give that property away, because it was a housing authority property, and but they were trying to woo Walter O'Malley, and so I think they would have promised him anything. And the deal was made, and the Dodgers came out, and everyone was so excited. I was little. My brother was the first honorary bat boy of the Dodgers. Everyone was there he is. Everyone was so excited because it was the Dodgers, right? We could have had any team, but the fact that it was the Dodgers, I think, made everybody really swell with pride. Now, when they first were coming out here, of course, the stadium wasn't built. Where were they going to play? And I told the story at the Coliseum Commission last month. So one night, my dad went to the Coliseum and took the baseball coach from Pepperdine, Johnny Scalinas, and they turned on the stadium lights at the Coliseum, and the baseball coach from Pepperdine went down on the field and measured it to see if they could play baseball in the Coliseum. And when he measured the field, he turned up to where my dad was, says, "You can play baseball here." And so that's where they started, was at the Coliseum. So, yeah, my brother was a huge fan. He had his little Dodger uniform on. Duke Snyder it was a number 4 uniform. That was his favorite player. But yeah, that was one of the fun things that my dad did was, well, along with Roz Wyman, was get the LA Dodgers here.
Jimmy was able to hang with the players and all this and that, partially because he was the boy. But were you interested in baseball and all of that? Would you have liked to have been able to do that?
I think I would have liked to, but if you look at all the early pitchers, it's always Jimmy. Jimmy was, because again, it was a father-son kind of a thing, and I think my dad didn't really think that maybe girls would be interested in that. So I was not the honorary bat girl. That did not even exist then. So yeah, it was sort of a boys thing that they perpetuated there. It's funny because later on I grew up to be the athlete in the family. I actually played softball, ran track, played volleyball. So I was athlete of the year in my high school. So it's kind of funny. I kind of did things despite being a girl.
And this is also from the Huntington. This was, I guess, the condolence card that Peter sent out. So the O'Malleys and the Hahns stayed close, it would appear.
Yeah, they did. They were good friends, and then Peter, was a good friend. Those were the days when the Dodgers were, owned by the family, and it really changed after that when some other owners came in and took over the Dodgers. The O'Malleys had a special, family-friendly, good relationship with the fans that really changed a little bit when they sold the Dodgers.
This is a photo of Gilbert Lindsay being sworn in to the 9th District in 1962, and Gordon, your Uncle Gordon, is back there. And we don't know that much about Gordon, which is a shame because he was actually elected first. I mean, he was elected to the State Assembly before
the State Assembly. He was. Yeah, he was elected to the State Assembly. And then he was on the city council. He was the 8th vote on the city council to sign the letter of intent, I believe, with the Dodgers. They had to bring him. I keep looking at Tom because maybe Tom has some of these memories too. But you need 8 votes on the city council to do anything. And they actually brought Gordon home from a vacation to be the 8th vote. Or maybe it was to put it, they had to have a charter amendment to have the baseball team. Yes, Tom, would you like to fill?
The district representative was Holland, and he did not want it.
Right.
So it's unusual that the council went against district representative, but this Wyman was from the 5th district, the west side, Mr. Hahn from the central part of the city,
I knew he'd know.
South LA. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah. So he was a key vote to bring the Dodgers here. And then he went on to run for assessor. And lost. And I believe he also put a bid in for Congress and lost to Charlie Wilson in Torrance. So, but yeah, he was the first Hahn to be elected.
And of course, this is one of those stories that we really don't. We may never know all of the details, but of course, Gordon decided not to run again for the 8th District on the council, and that allowed Billy Mills to become the second African American on the council. And then, of course, Tom Bradley was also elected that same year. And so that was a sea change on the council.
Gil Lindsay was the first.
Yeah, and Gil Lindsay actually worked for your father.
Yes, he did work for my father. And Gil was appointed to the city council. I wonder if that was the last appointment.
John Crow was the last appointment.
Okay. See, Tom should be like sitting up here. Yeah. Huh?
Gil was
Yeah. So that was quite historic that they orchestrated the appointment for Gilbert Lindsay to be the first African-American to sit on the City Council of Los Angeles. It was quite a coup.
Yeah. Bob Farrell, when he was up here last month, and he asked me, or he just happened to say, I have no idea how they managed to pull that off.
Yeah.
And I think he was hoping that you might have some insight in that, but I don't think you said you did.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
did.
So Tom does.
Well, Gil was a great deputy for your father.
Yes.
And I think the love that they had for that and having bridged the gap, prior to that, Mr. Lindsay worked at Water Power. And he was the first one ever to be elected from Water Power. Do you know, Michael, who the second one was?
No.
Anybody know? Clark? You. Thank you, Clark Roberts. It is. Bridge builder, Clark Roberts. Thank you, Michael. But it's interesting, but your father loved people.
He did.
That's the one thing you got to say. And very quickly, I worked for a printer down on Vermont, Washington, and all he talked about is Kenny Hahn and his deputy Marlowe at the time.
Very
If there's a problem, you deal with the deputy. Just to tell you how different it is right now, the story in the paper about 311 and everybody's upset about the calls. Kenny Hahn wanted every call that a citizen had a problem to his office so he could help them. That's what his really service was all about.
True. And our home, right? Our home. People knocked on our door all the time, Saturday morning, Sunday morning. Sometimes I would, as a teenager, you sleep a little bit later, and I would come out from my bedroom, and there would be a constituent in our living room. And Ramona would have put on another pot of coffee, and my dad would be asking them what their problem was. And he said, okay, I'll take care of it. People came to him with all different kinds of problems. And one of the things he never did, and this was his belief about public service, right? You never said, that's not my problem, you know, you're mistaken. You need to go talk to your assembly member, or that's a county problem, or that's a state or a federal. He never said that, and he would not allow any of his deputies to ever say that. Someone, because most people, honestly, they don't really know. Is this a city issue? Is this a county issue? Is this a state? Is this federal? Most people, if they've gotten to your door, if they've gotten a call into your office, help them. You know, that's all they needed to do was get to you. And he, if it wasn't something the county did, then he would make sure that he got their complaint to the right person. But people came to him with all manner of problems, and he always would carry a little black book, and he would write it down, and he said, I'll you know, Monday morning when I get to work, I'll take care of it, and he always did. And again, till this day, I have people coming up to me saying, I asked your father once for this, and I'll never forget, he was the only one that helped us. So that sort of was instilled in me, and that's how I try to be in my political jobs, the same thing. Help people, answer their questions. Everybody deserves an answer. Return their call, answer their letter, and let them know that you're working for them, right? I work for the people. That's it. They're my employers. And if I'm going to do a good job, I have to do it for them. And I have to make sure that they get their problems answered. Doesn't always work, but I try. But Kenny taught me that.
And I think maybe that's just an interesting, maybe there's an interesting point to bring this up now. You actually did get into the family business for a long time. I mean, you know, you did go into politics. You know, your brother went from Pepperdine to civil service, but you didn't take that.
I didn't. I strayed. I was the prodigal daughter. I don't know why. I didn't understand my DNA. I didn't understand that it was the family business. It was my destiny too. And I tried other things. None of them worked out real well for me. Although, honestly, I'm one of those that believes all things happen for a reason. And I think every job I did until I became an elected council member actually worked to make me a better elected official. I was a secondary, I have my credential, I'm a secondary teacher. I worked for a utility company, Southern California Edison. I worked for a trash company. I worked on recycling for that trash company. I actually taught different municipalities how to recycle and do curbside recycling. I was an investment banker and worked in public finance for municipal bonds. And so when I became, finally, when my destiny hit me, and I was finally elected to the city council, guess what we were dealing with on a regular basis? Trash, utilities, municipal bonds, public finance. And so it all actually helped make me a better councilwoman.
And when we were having our conversation a week ago or so, something that really got my interest was you told me a couple of things. The first is that you hated the idea of legacy. Your father didn't like the idea of legacy or having things named after him, and so and that what you wanted to do during your time as a supervisor is build upon the work that your father did, basically strengthen the things that he put in motion, laid the groundwork for. And so looking at certainly one of the first ones, and probably one of the ones that definitely had an impact, the call box system, which ironically, because of cell phone technology and all that, is falling out of use. But for a long time, how can you manage being stuck on the freeway somewhere and not have one of those things, save you? And yet, that was not a popular idea.
Great story. Again, this goes back to Kenny Hahn, loving people, solving problems, driving home from work one night on the Harbor Freeway. I grew up at Florence and Crenshaw, so off the Harbor Freeway, you would take the Manchester to exit to go towards Crenshaw. He saw a woman literally trying to climb the embankment of the freeway. And he pulled his car over and noticed that she'd had 3 or 4 children that she'd left in the car while she was literally climbing the embankment. And so he's like, "Lady, what are you doing? Come down." And so she said, "I ran out of gas and I didn't know how to get off the freeway for help. Didn't know how to get help." So he put her in his car. They went and got a gallon of gas, and he saw her on her way. But he went home that night and he said, there has to be a way that people could call for help if they run into trouble when they're on the freeway. And again, before cell phones. So his idea was to put telephones on the freeway, which again, everybody thought was a crazy idea. But again, he was a seller of ideas, and he believed that it was the right thing to do. And he was dogged about that. And so he wanted to just try it. Let's just put phones every quarter of a mile on the Harbor Freeway for, I don't know, a few miles, 5 miles. Let's just try it and see if it works. So he asked the state transportation department, "Hey, can we put some phone?" "No, absolutely not. We're not going to do that." So it was Governor Pat Brown at the time was the governor. And subsequently to that, Governor Brown called my dad and said, "Hey, Kenny, are you going to be my re-election chairman for Southern California?" To which he said, "No." And Governor Brown said, "Why not?" My dad said, "Because your people won't let me try this idea of putting telephones on the freeway." And Governor Brown said, okay, Kenny, come on up to Sacramento and we'll see. So my dad flew up to Sacramento, explained it to Governor Brown, why it was a good idea, why don't we just try this? And as my dad tells the story, Governor Brown picked up his phone to his Department of Transportation across the street and said, I'm sending a guy named Kenny Hahn over, give him what he wants. And they tried it as a pilot program, and it was so successful. There were thousands of calls that came in the first few months of the program, and they knew it was a success. And until cell phones, I don't know how many of you maybe ever used one, but I know for me, since I knew those were my dad's phones, I would look, and I always would see somebody whose car was stranded and was finding the phone. It was very amazing to me that those call boxes are now international. They are everywhere. You go into remote places in other countries, and you will see these call boxes. And so it was an idea that he believed in, and he sold it and used a little political leverage to get what he wanted.
Now, is that the phone you actually have in your office? That one model?
Yeah, I do have that phone in my office as a reminder of a great invention. And you know, they're actually called the Kenneth Hahn call boxes. If you look at your DMV bill, your annual bill, there is a percentage of the fee that goes towards maintaining the Kenneth Hahn call boxes.
Okay. This is a photo of your father, and Jim's in there, and Gil's in there presenting a resolution to Billy Graham. Mm-hmm. You had a Billy Graham story, and now, and actually, you're somewhere in that photo also.
I'm over here. Story of my life. I'm like over here. Yeah, so my father became friends with Billy Graham, obviously in 1949 when he had his very first tent revival. That's what launched his Billy Graham Crusades at Hill in Washington. My dad would have been on the city council at the time and helped him, I think, get the permits for that revival. It was supposed to be a few days, and it went on to be 8 weeks because it was so successful. Then later in 1963, he had another Billy Graham crusade in the Coliseum. And he reached out to my dad because the attendance was going to be much higher than the Coliseum allowed for. The Coliseum at that point was maybe 93,000 seats, a little more, 100,000? 102. Okay, 102,000, okay. And he said, what should we do? And my dad said, I think you should let people spill out onto the grass area. The fire chief at the time in the county was opposed to that idea, but my dad said, we'll do it anyway. And as a result of that, to this day, Billy Graham holds the all-time attendance record for any one event at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. Not a sporting event, not a Bruce Springsteen concert, not a Dodger game, but one sermon. He holds the record, and so there's a plaque that my dad had put up in the Court of Honor outside the Coliseum that commemorates that day. So they became friends, and then when he got a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, he wanted my dad to help raise some money to make sure that star went in. So they remained friends through the end of their life. And I just was invited to attend his memorial service in North Carolina last week. My chief of staff, Nick Ippolito, and I traveled to North Carolina, and I had a moment to talk to Franklin, the son, and remind him that his dad held the all-time attendance record at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. And Franklin said, "Oh yes, your father and my father were dear friends his whole life."
And of course, this is a famous shot of your father and Martin Luther King. There are a couple of interesting stories about the two of them. And I heard one the other day that, well, you tell her.
This was this was early 1961, 62, first time that Dr. Martin Luther King had ever visited Los Angeles, and he was speaking at a church, Victory Baptist Church, and the pastor of the church wanted someone to go to the airport and give Dr. King an official welcome to Los Angeles. And again, this was at the height of civil unrest in the South. This is where we were seeing people beaten and fire hoses put on children who were marching for civil rights. So he was an extremely controversial figure at the time. And this pastor kind of went down the list of the mayor of Los Angeles, the council members, the state senators, the assembly members. Everybody was busy. Everyone had a scheduling conflict and couldn't make it to the airport to greet Dr. King. When he got to my dad and said, "Kenny, would you consider going out there?" My dad said, "I would be honored. I would be honored to greet Dr. King," and brought him a nice official scroll. As you can see, he went right to the tarmac and to the United Airlines stairs there, and brought along a county photographer. We have a county photographer, Martin, there. My dad was very good about bringing along a county photographer. Otherwise, that moment would have never been captured. Then he put Dr. King in his own car, and they had some time to kill before he preached that night. He drove him around his district. He wanted to drive him to Watts and show Dr. King of this African-American community here in the heart of Los Angeles, and how proud my dad was to represent that community. Then he took him downtown to the county building and took him up in his office and actually gave him a cup of coffee and sat him at his conference table and got to have this one-on-one with Dr. Martin Luther King. And according to my father, my dad believes that Dr. King talked to my dad about his hopes and dreams for this country, what he thought was the vision of this country for his children and other children. So my dad thinks he heard the "I Have a Dream" speech first. And my dad was so impressed with Dr. King that this is the only time he ever did it. The chair that Dr. King sat in my dad's office, he decided to put a little brass plaque on the back that said Dr. King sat in this chair, and it's now in the little museum at the Baldwin Hills Park that has some of my father's mementos and things, and that chair with that plaque is on there. So that's very special. But one of the things that, my dad told a lot of stories, right? You never really knew if they were really true. He might have embellished or exaggerated. We didn't know, but, when my son, Mark, was at Pepperdine, they still have Convocation Chapel regularly, and Martin Luther King III spoke at a Pepperdine convocation. And Mark made his way up after Martin Luther King III had stopped talking and introduced himself and said, "My grandfather was Kenny Hahn," to which, thankfully, Martin Luther King III said, "Oh my gosh, our father loved your grandfather. He came home from that trip and was so taken aback by this kind white politician that treated him so nicely. So I loved it. The story was verified in the King family. They talked about it just like we talked about it in the Hahn family. And when he fought to build the hospital in Watts after the Watts riots, after the McCone Commission looked at the root causes of that riot, one of the number one reasons was the lack of access to health care. The people in Watts had to travel so far to get health care that many of them died, not necessarily because of their injury or their illness, but because of the distance they had to travel to Big General Hospital. So he believed that they needed a hospital. That's a whole other story. I'm not even going to get into that today. But there was a hospital built there, and he knew he wanted to name it after Dr. King. So this was after Dr. King had been assassinated. He called Coretta Scott King, and he said, Mrs. King, you probably don't know who I am, but if it's okay with you, I'd like to name this new hospital after your husband. To which she said, oh no, Mr. Hahn, we know who you are. When my Martin came home, he couldn't stop talking about that white politician that was so kind to him. So it was a good story.
Now, so the paramedics.
Yes.
Another idea that, I mean, I don't think anyone can think of life without it, but yet it was controversial. It was kind of an out there idea, but your father managed to get it through. And so any idea on how that came about?
Again, good idea. My dad's heart doctor came up to him and said, how would you like to save a life a day? And my father said, of course, especially if they're registered to vote. He said, yes, and this doctor said, if you can get to somebody who's having a heart attack in that golden hour, in that first hour, you have a better chance of saving their life than if you transport them to a hospital. By the time they see somebody, the odds are they won't make it. And so it was my dad's cardiologist who thought a mobile heart van would work to get the drugs administered to someone having a heart attack immediately in that golden hour. And it morphed into the idea of firefighters who obviously already had the equipment and were already rolling out on emergencies. But there had to be, state law had to be changed to allow someone other than a medical professional, a nurse or a doctor, to administer these drugs. So he got assembly member and a senator, Wedworth and Townsend, carried the legislation in our state legislature to change the law. It passed the Assembly and the Senate and was on its way to the desk of then Governor Ronald Reagan. Everyone was against this. The nurses were against it. The doctors were against it. Even the fire chief of LA County was against it. He told my dad, Kenny, my men are firemen, they're not medicine men. Even he was against it. Everyone was against it. But again, my dad knew it was a good idea, and it made sense, and he just had to sort of convince everybody. He got word from the governor's office that Reagan was going to veto it. California Medical Association was against it. I mean, these are powerful lobbying interests that most politicians wouldn't want to go against. And I think all that got to Governor Reagan, and he had signaled that he would veto it. And my dad said, can I just come up there to Sacramento and make the case one more time? And those were the days it was easy to fly to Sacramento, right? You could just go to the airport, no TSA, no security, get on a plane and get up there in an hour. So he flew up to Sacramento, and the governor saw him and said, come on in, Kenny. And my dad said, let me make the case to you again why this will save lives. It's get to a person in the first hour, they're having a heart attack. Literally, this will save lives every single day. Governor Reagan said, let me ask you one thing, Mr. Hahn. These mobile units, will they be able to cross jurisdictional lines? Can they go from city to city and just reach the person? And my dad said, yes, this was a concept. It was based on a base hospital, and it was a mile parameter, 5-mile parameter around the closest hospital is where the victim would be transported. To which Governor Reagan said, I'm going to sign it. And my dad said, what's changed your mind? And he said, my own father died of a heart attack where they were living in Beverly Hills. Yeah, I knew Tom would know. Because his mom called for an ambulance. He was having a heart attack. The ambulance came and got to the city line and turned around and went back without radioing ahead to someone else that there was a heart attack victim. So isn't that interesting? Which just goes to show for all of us, we make decisions based on our own personal experiences and what's happened in our own lives, and how, if it was up to us, we would change policy. And that's exactly what happened. Paramedic bill was signed into law, and again, I don't think any of us would imagine life without paramedics. But it was a vision that Kenny had.
And kind of turning that back around to the idea that what you want to do is build upon your father's work. And so building upon the paramedic model, you want to bring us up to speed on stroke units.
So 2 things we're doing in the County of Los Angeles that I think would make my dad smile. One is we now have a new protocol for the paramedics if someone is suffering a stroke, if they have the symptoms of a stroke. Currently, the paramedics transport someone to the closest hospital. But under our new protocol in the County of Los Angeles, we now instruct our paramedics, if someone is experiencing a stroke, to take them to the nearest comprehensive stroke center. And we have, I want to say 11 in LA County that are actually equipped. The moment someone is rolled in, they know they have the neurologist ready there treating somebody who is experiencing a stroke. So we just experienced that a couple weeks ago in San Pedro. It was the day the county rolled out this new protocol. The paramedics in their roll call that morning said, okay, guys, and not very many women still as paramedics, but okay, guys, today, the new protocol, if someone is experiencing symptoms of a stroke, you are to now take them, you're to bypass the closest hospital and take them directly to one of these comprehensive stroke centers. It happened in San Pedro, an 80-year-old woman. Her family called. She was experiencing slurred speech, numbness in her arm, clearly all the signs. And because they had just talked about it in roll call that morning, the paramedic said, I think this is one of those cases. The closest hospital at the time was San Pedro Hospital, and the paramedics told her family, we're not taking her to this San Pedro Hospital, we're taking her to Little Company of Mary in Torrance, was the stroke hospital. She got there was a neurologist waiting. He actually immediately took her in, and it was a blood clot. And actually, they have a very teeny tiny thread of a needle now that they can go right in and unclog that clot in your brain. She walked out of the hospital. So I think, again, to think that it was my dad's first state law that mandated that paramedics obviously do their protocol, and now in the county we're changing that. The other thing I'm convinced is the next idea, like the original paramedics, was told that if you can reach a stroke victim in the first hour, same thing, golden hour, which is why the paramedics now will take someone to a comprehensive stroke unit. There is a mobile stroke unit, like the original paramedic unit. And this is a rolling hospital that gets to the stroke victim and has on board a neurologist, a nurse, a paramedic, and a mobile CAT scan. They can actually scan a person's brain right there in a restaurant, if they're at home, if they're at work, if they're at school, and tell what kind of stroke they're having, either the kind that causes the bleeding or the kind that causes the blockage, and both are treated obviously very differently. And so I convinced my colleagues on the Board of Supervisors to appropriate a little over $1 million last year so that we now have a mobile stroke unit. There's one that's in Santa Monica, and now there's one in Long Beach every other week. And I feel like it's sort of the same idea that my dad had those many years ago. It's just it's the new crisis, is people having strokes and getting to them just as quickly as we used to think about someone with a heart attack.
Where else do you see this idea going as far as other types of, whether mental illness, for example, or some other sort of things?
So the other piece of the law that that they passed on the paramedics was that the paramedics have to take you to an emergency room, a medical facility. I'm sure that was part of it. So one of the things we're finding now is that the number of people who have mental health challenges are actually, people are calling 911 about them, and the paramedics will respond, and the only thing they can do right now is to take them to emergency rooms or a hospital. And we're finding out that, number one, our emergency rooms are completely overcrowded. With this recent flu epidemic, I mean, there were some hospitals that were putting tents up in their parking lot to accommodate people who were coming into the emergency room. And mental health professionals are finding that that's the worst place for someone to go when they're sort of having some mental health challenges. Maybe they're having a meltdown. An ER is the wrong place. I don't know how many of you have been in the ER, right? They're loud, they're noisy, there's people who are in anguish, and it's not a good place if you are having a mental health challenge as opposed to having a physical emergency. So in LA County, we're beginning to have mental health urgent care places where folks can go, where there's mental health professionals. They're a little more calming, they're a little more serene, they're a little more about, let's find out what's going on, and do you need medication? Can we connect you with something else? And we also have sobering centers. So, when folks have had a little too much to drink, we have sobering centers, which also, paramedics get called to respond to people who have had too much to drink. And again, the only thing they can do is take them to the emergency room. Probably not the best place for someone. So we're trying to get the law changed, that very same law that my father passed those many, many years ago, so that paramedics can take someone who's having a mental health issue to one of these mental health urgent cares, and to someone who needs to go to a sobering center, they can take them to a sobering center. Right now, that's against the law. They can't do it. So even though it's a common sense thing, I think everyone would agree this is a better option for people. They cannot currently do it. So I'm working with Assemblymember Mike Gibson to change the law to allow our paramedics to triage someone, which they already do, when they decide where to take people and give them this option. So we'll see. Guess what? Guess who's against this? The nurses are against it. The emergency room physicians are against it. The California Medical Association, I think they're against it. So I'm kind of fighting the same battle my dad fought, but I think it's the right thing to do, and I think most people would agree with it.
That being said, do you have your father's salesman skills?
You know, I don't know. I would hope to think I do. I would hope to think that's partly how I've lasted so long, as I was able to sell some ideas along the way.
And again, along that line, when you finally decided to get into the family business, you got in at the city council level, nonpartisan, minimum of 8 votes to get anything done, or 10 votes, et cetera, and so forth. Then you go to the U.S. Congress, completely opposite, totally partisan. Now you've come back to L.A., nonpartisan, and so what works? What works as far as the way your DNA is is built?
I was just going to say, Charlie Mims, I started out on the Charter Reform Commission in 1997. Mayor Reardon decided it was an opportunity to overhaul our 75-year-old charter, which still had things in it that didn't really make sense anymore. It was sort of a piecemeal book that really governed Los Angeles, and it was long and outdated and a patchwork of every time the city council did something, they either amended it or changed it. Mayor Reardon decided that we needed to change it. He thought we should have elected charter reform commissioners, 15, one from each city council district. Meanwhile, the city council was feeling a little bit threatened by that, so they appointed their own charter reform commission of 21 people. So we had the elected, and I ran for that. Even my brother thought it was a bad idea. I thought, why are you running for this obscure, nobody knows what this is. And I thought, you know what, this will be a good foray for me into city government, because if elected and if I actually work on this, the Bible of city government, I will have had a front row seat, City Government 101, and no one could ever out city government me because I wrote the book. So I was elected to that. Charlie, we worked together on that document for 2 years. We put it before the voters in 1999. It was passed. And among other things, it created neighborhood councils. It created regional planning commissions. It was a great experience for me to do that. But back to your question, I like local government. And to be honest, I think this whole country feels like Washington, D.C. is a little on the broken side. And I think most people will say that local government matters, whether it's your water board, whether it's your school board, whether it's your city council, your county government. That's where I think people are going to look to for their problems to be solved, because I don't think they think Congress is going to solve their problems. In fact, I think some people think it makes it worse. So I like nonpartisan. It fits better for me. When I was back in Congress, I worked hard to reach across that aisle. There really is an aisle in the House of Representatives. Democrats sit on one side, Republicans sit on the other. You don't spend a lot of time talking to each other. In committee meetings, Republicans actually walk in a different door. The Democrats walk in a different door. You don't sit together in committees. You don't really eat together. You don't meet together. Very little time to talk together. Most of us come home on the weekends to our districts, so we don't have any social time together. And I didn't like that as much. I like working with everybody to solve a problem. I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat or independent or decline to state. I like bringing different perspectives together to solve a problem. And that's, I think, what nonpartisan government does. And it's more fun for me. I enjoy it much more.
A couple of other questions, and then I think we'll be able to open it up to the floor if there's any questions. How would your father feel about the makeup of the Board of Supervisors today? You know, he was a forward thinker in a lot of ways, but he was also a product of his time.
Yeah, my father would not have ever conceived of the idea that there would be 4 women and 1 man on the County Board of Supervisors. I mean, it just wouldn't have entered his thought process. He was a product of his time. He, again, maybe a little bit of a male chauvinist. You know, I think there was 1 woman on the board when he was there, and you know, that was like, okay, we have 1 woman. The idea of 4 women on that County Board of Supervisors would have, again, I don't think he would have ever entered his brain. When I walk on Tuesdays, when I walk to the hearing room, to the Board of Supervisors, you walk through this hallway in the back that has a photo, right, of every year of every Board of Supervisors all lined up, you know, so there, every one of them is 5 men, you know, until Gloria Molina was the first one. And so it is kind of funny to see, and they're all white males, right? Every one of them. So it has changed. It's not the Board of Supervisors of my dad, but I think it's very indicative of where we are in our society, that we have a female majority on you know, one of the largest counties in the United States. I think it's important. I didn't have that many women role models in politics when I was growing up. There were very few at that time. It just wasn't something I could look to and say, oh, one day I'm going to do that. They didn't exist. And so I think now it's important, and I think particularly in LA County, I think it's great that little girls growing up in LA County will look at this, you know, very prestigious, powerful board and see people looking like her. And I think that's important.
Do you see yourself as someone's role model?
I don't see myself like that, but knowing how all of us growing up, we seem to want to find somebody that looks like us that we can say, I can do that. And so I know I will be, you know, for some girl out there to think that she can do this too.
And then the last question that I have, and then of course anything you have to say beyond that is, you know, it's up to you. The clip that I showed of you talking about the Merchant Mariners bill, and that was something that was very close and dear to your heart that you alluded to very briefly in that clip. But I wanted to give you a chance to explain why that is and what has or has not happened with that idea.
That's part of my disappointment in this United States House of Representatives. You think something like that, who wouldn't agree with you know, thanking our merchant mariners by some small token of you know, a small sum of money, because they did lose out on all the GI benefits that most of our returning veterans had. They got to buy their first home, they got to go to college. I mean, they got to do all the things that bill enabled them. By the time our merchant mariners were recognized as veterans, they were 60, you know, so they already bought their first home, they'd already gone to college, they didn't get the benefits. So I took that fight when I went to Congress. I'm thinking, okay, now I'm in Congress. I don't have to stand in the well of the City Council of Los Angeles and urge Congress to do something. I am Congress. It takes an act of Congress, by golly, now I'm here. Well, 5.5 years later, nothing. Never got any traction. We changed it so it wasn't even $1,000 a month. It was like a one set payment of $25,000 for each remaining mariner, not even spouses or survivors. And every year, there was only 5,000 remaining World War II merchant mariners, and that was like a couple of years ago. I understand we lose almost half every year. So we changed it to that. That didn't get traction. Then the closest I came to being a part of something that honored them, I got enough of my colleagues' signatures to have a bill that would award them the Congressional Gold Medal, each surviving mariner. Even that, the Speaker of the House at the time, Paul Ryan, would not allow that to go forward to present them. So those are frustrating things to me. I'm sure if I was on the city council or even my supervisor, if I said, let's honor merchant mariners with something, it would be unanimous. But when you're in a body of 435 people, everyone has different agendas and different constituencies that they're answering to. It just wasn't easy. So you think something that it was very easy, honoring our veterans, would be something that we could all rally around. It didn't happen. So that was a big regret for me to leave Congress without having done that.
And again, because your Uncle Gordon was in the Merchant Marines. He didn't get the GI Bill, so he couldn't have gone to Pepperdine the way that your father did.
That's correct.
Because he was actually in the Navy.
That's correct. That's correct. And really, my dad was a captain of a ship in World War II, and it was a ship that delivered supplies. It delivered, the butter and the cheese and the bacon to the troops. So it was a very similar job of the merchant mariners, and yet the Navy was a veteran. I even subtly try to continue to honor our merchant mariners, because most time it's the 5 branches of the military that are honored at sporting events. And I wrote a letter to the Nationals, the baseball team back there, because every halftime they honor the 5 branches of the military. And I said, you're missing one of the branches. You're missing the merchant mariners. So I always still try to thank them. They were very unprepared they were sitting ducks in the war. They were unprepared to be fired upon, and many times they were ferrying troops too. And there were stories of the sailors having to man the guns because when they were fired on. So it was a really real bravery for the men of the Merchant Marine to do what they did. So I'll keep trying to honor them in the best way I can.
All right, we do have a microphone on the floor if someone wishes to ask a question.
Hi. It wasn't just Martin Luther King. Your family is legendary for being simpatico with African Americans and the African American community, helping empower them politically, and also getting them jobs. Can you tell us about that, please?
Well, again, I think a lot of my dad's perspective on life and people was the story of Hattie and the 7 boys, right? They grew up in poverty, and I think my father never forgot that. My father lived and died no more than 2 miles from where he was born. He lived a very simple life. Again, we had one home at Crenshaw and Florence. His first suit, he likes to say, was when he was in the Navy. They were very poor, and I think he never forgot that. And it gave him great empathy for the people he served. And he was sort of such a unique figure. I didn't really understand all that growing up and how important that was to the civil rights of the African American community here in Los Angeles, but he believed that the people he represented a majority African American district for his entire 40 years on the Board of Supervisors. He was their leader, their spokesman, their advocate, their champion. He made sure that there was just as many swimming pools built in his district than all the other districts. He made sure there were parks that were built in his district because he saw that happening in all the other places in the county. Why wouldn't his district have the same blessings and resources that every other district did? And he really believed that. And he believed in making sure that there were opportunities in terms of jobs and careers. And that legacy, he can have a legacy, right? I'm just not going to have a legacy. But, you know, and again, I hear people come up, and when, again, my dad was alive, they would come up and talk to him, and I'll never, one of the things he did was build swimming pools, right? And he always had when he opened the swimming pool, he lined up all the kids, and he's 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready, 4 to go, and then they would all jump in. Many of them couldn't, probably none of them could swim, but he would make sure they got to jump in on when he opened the pool. And then he believed in free swimming lessons. He thought every kid should learn to swim for free in these swimming pools. Many years later, when we were out, a fine, strapping African-American man came up to us when we were out, and he said, "I've always wanted to thank you, Mr. Hahn. I was one of those kids that you let jump in when that pool was open. I couldn't swim. But learned to swim, and he said, I've had a career my entire life as a county lifeguard, and it was a career that served me well. Currently, there's sons and daughters of people who my dad helped to get jobs in the county who are now in the county. One of my favorites is my dad, who was an elevator operator in the county building. Remember when they used to have elevator operators? Davis Lear was an elevator operator. And he said, you know, Mr. Hahn, if there was ever anything I could do for you, I would like to. My dad said, great, you know, come work for me. He ended up being the staff member that drove my dad everywhere. So we got to be good friends with Davis Lear and his family. His son, Brian, who I see all the time at the county building, is going to retire next year after 35 years in the county in our internal services department. So kids, grandkids have good jobs, and he believed in that. And you know, it was amazing because I think the later in my dad's career, I think there was a sense that, you know, the African American community probably should elect, an African American to represent them. And Billy Mills was the one that challenged him in 1968. And I think my dad honestly thought that year, you know what? I've done a good job. I've represented them well, but maybe it's time that, you know, they elect Billy Mills. He beat him 2-1 at the polls. It would have been a story probably, but on the same night that my dad beat Billy Mills so resoundingly, Bobby Kennedy was shot at the Ambassador Hotel in 1968. So that became the story. But I think that community, or any community, what they loved about him was what we've been talking about. You know, he really cared about people. He treated everybody with respect and dignity, and he believed everybody had a right to a slice of the American dream here in Los Angeles County, just like he and his 6 brothers did. Hi.
Now, but and I mentioned this ever so briefly. but your father he wasn't comfortable with having things named after him.
He wasn't. You know, because he said it only takes 3 votes to remove it. So he didn't like that because he'd seen that happen. He'd seen that happen where people removed other people's names off of buildings. So he wasn't comfortable. He did, you know, it's hard to keep saying no because so many people wanted to name things after him. And there are a few things around town that are named after him. And again, for me, what a thrill for me to walk into that county building every day that's named for my father. That was Ed Edelman, was the county supervisor. And on my dad's retirement in 1992, it was Ed Edelman who introduced the motion to name that building because it was so synonymous with Kenny Hahn, county government. In fact, it had been there for 40 years. I think that was quite a tribute. But my dad was not comfortable with talking about legacies, and he just felt so blessed every day to have that job.
Well, I wanted to say that he was also really beloved by the Asian American community, and his staff was really reflective of his district. And I know when I first met your dad, Mas Fukai was his chief of staff.
Right.
And it was through Mas and your dad that I'd say during a certain period of time, every single Asian Pacific agency that had county funding, it was because of him.
Mm-hmm.
And we still remember and respect and admire that. But I always will remember Mas spoke so highly of your dad and cared, you know, his principles and his style of work. And it made me feel that your dad mentored everybody on his staff, and I wanted to know if you had some stories about that.
Well, he was a professor. He was a teacher at heart. So he did a lot of teaching and schooling, and maybe mentoring is the word. But he would teach his staff members, school them, correct them, discipline them, yeah, again, he believed in eyeballing everything himself, but he did have field deputies, so he would. But there was one story where one of his field deputies, somebody had called about an abandoned car, and so he dispatched his field deputy to go check on it, and she came back and said, no, from what we understand, car is just there. It's not really a nuisance yet. So my father, just on an instinct, went out to check it out himself, took her out there with him. And my dad, I think, got down on his hands and knees and noticed a spider web growing in the wheel well of the car, to which prompted a lesson about, no, you didn't really. You didn't tell the truth about this. You didn't really research this enough. Yeah, he did a lot of gathering them together, talking, schooling, because apparently his brand of politics was it's not, even though it seems common sense, apparently it wasn't for most people. And he just had to keep reminding them of why they were there, who they worked for, the people. But yeah, there was, but he loved his staff members, and he gave them great, respect. And Mas Fukai was my dad's chief of deputy. His daughter, Janice Fukai, is, of course, the alternate public defender in the county of Los Angeles. So Janice and I get to work together.
Okay, we have time for a couple more.
There's one down here.
Thank you so much. It's great to see you. I know you work with the Metro as well as you're on the board. And I was just wondering what you think about the bicycle master plan across the county.
Well, I do know that there has been a push to make Los Angeles more bicycle friendly. It hasn't taken. It's not taken with great love and respect everywhere. I know in my own town of San Pedro, the residents got a little upset when lanes were taken away and given to bike lanes. I see some of my fellow San Pedrins nodding their head. But I do know that since I've been on the city council, the bicyclist enthusiasts in our city have really been pushing to have more, have more sharing of lanes and more respect. So that's part of even the 710 freeway project that we voted on last week. It includes some early action items, and part of those are everything from interchange of the 405 and the 710 improvements to on-ramp, off-ramp improvements to bike lanes in Long Beach. So there is a movement towards that. Who? To have who? Oh. Oh, in the city. Oh, okay. The city of Los Angeles. Yeah. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom. Yeah.
Okay, this will be the last one.
I just want to say thank you because my mother was a physician that worked at Martin Luther King Hospital, and we've lived in the View Park area for 50 years, and there's a park with your father's name on it right across the street from La Brea and Stalker, and your family has been so instrumental. I remember my mother always telling us as kids when she would go vote for Kenny Hahn, and all of her colleagues, physicians in different fields of medicine, would always vote for your father. So I just want to say thank you. It is a pleasure knowing more about you and seeing you here today.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. He loved that hospital, and he did many spot checks. We would be driving somewhere else. The next thing you know, we'd be veering off to Martin Luther King Hospital. Yes, he was famous for sending those photographs out to people. Now, I've been in many homes, particularly in the African American community, where the grandmother has 3 photos hanging in the breakfast nook, one of Martin Luther King, one of Jesus, and one of Kenny Hahn. So I've been in homes where that is the truth. Yeah, I know. And I was loved, and I know we have one more, so I think Stephanie has. I was loved because Kenny was so loved. And I am very honest about my heritage. And the first time I ran for office, I know people loved me and voted for me because I was Kenny's daughter. And, well, we don't really know you, but we know your dad. If you're anything like your dad, we love you too. And I have literally basked in the glow and the love that Kenny Hahn had. I always want people are like, don't you want to make a name for yourself? I'm like, you know what? Listen, I mean, I'm happy to sit here all afternoon and talk about Kenny. And even when I first ran for office, right? I mean, I wanted on your ballot, your ballot designation, you can use 3 words. I tried to get the court to approve Kenny Hahn's daughter as my ballot designation. That's how much he was loved and revered and respected because he put public service into being a public servant. He never forgot that it was public service. He was a servant of the people. And that's a bar that all of us who are elected should never forget. And we should all strive for that. Yes, Ms. Martisich.
Thank you. And you definitely glow all the time. One thing that was left out in all your biographical information, not only did she have all those amazing jobs before going into public office, which makes her better for what she did, she was a wife and then a single parent and a working mother. And that's so stupendous and a great role model. And one of the things that hasn't been brought up, speaking of role model and the empowerment, and it is Women's History Month, is all the amazing things you are doing for girls and young women, and the conference or the event I went to with you in Long Beach, where it was all about women for jobs, working in things like welding and
construction,
so forth.
yeah.
So if you could just enlighten this group with some of that, I think it would be so important because it's pretty amazing what you're doing.
Well, again, sitting on Metro, I realized right off the bat that our contractors were not even reaching our very low goal of having women in the trades. I think our goal is like 6% of the jobs, which is very low, and our contractors were around 2 or 3%. So I've been championing these events, women in the trades kinds of events where we're bringing all the building trades, the electricians, the bricklayers, the iron workers, the cement folks, all of them, and putting them in touch with women who want to go into this line of work. Not to mention architects, engineers. I mean, every transportation project we do has a number of pretty amazing jobs connected to it. So I just don't want contractors to give me an excuse like, well, we'd like to hire more women, but they just aren't trained to be in this field. So I'm trying to end that and make sure that women are connected with these very good, high-paying jobs that are connected to all sorts of transportation projects. The voters of LA County just passed Measure M. It's going to be $120 billion worth of projects that we are going to build in LA County. There's no reason that everybody shouldn't benefit, and women included. And yes, I raised 3 pretty wonderful kids. Katie will be 40 this year. Danny is 37, and Mark would be 34. And then I have 5 darling grandkids. I know everybody thinks their grandkids are the cutest. Mine really are. And so yeah, I have a family as well. So it's pretty. It's very satisfying for me to have been born into this amazing family. We didn't really even talk about my brother and what a great legacy he has had in the city of Los Angeles. He's the only person that has been the city attorney, city controller, and the elected mayor of Los Angeles. No one has ever held all 3 citywide positions. Jim was the mayor while I was on. What are you trying to do, Tom? He kept the city together. Yes, when the city was trying to break up, Jim really championed keeping Los Angeles, Los Angeles. But it's a great family, and so for me to follow literally in my dad's footsteps, both on the city council of Los Angeles and now as county supervisor, is a real thrill for me. I have a sneaking suspicion, even though he never nurtured me in this way, that he probably knew that I was the one in the family that would love this line of work just as much as he did, and would do a good job because I learned at the foot of the greatest, I think, elected official we have ever had in Los Angeles County.
All right, I think that is probably a good spot to end our conversation. I wanted to thank Supervisor Hahn for coming out and sharing some of her family with us.
Thank you, Michael.
And Supervisor Hahn, on behalf of the Historical Society, I'd like to present you with our premier signature publication. This is our 2-volume history on the governance of the city of Los Angeles. I suspect you are mentioned in it in one way or another. I know there's a chapter on charter reform. So we'd like to present you with that.
Thank you.
And thank you very much. How about one more round of applause for Supervisor, County Supervisor?